Welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast, bringing you interviews, reviews and fishing tips. Here's your host, Pete Tigers.
Welcome back, everyone, to the very latest Fly Culture Podcast. Well, we've had some rain. The rivers have come up. We've swung some flies for salmon, and I was very, very pleased and proud to be on netting duty for my wife on Sunday, who caught a beautiful salmon. The most shocking thing about it was that it was on one of my flies, which I'm absolutely astounded by. So I'm really, really pleased about that. And it was great to see that. We've had a whole lot more rain. So we're just waiting for the river to drop back a little bit before we go after the salmon once again. My other worry now is, again, after recent podcasts, and this is going to be a topic today, is with rivers up, does that mean that water companies are going to be discharging sewage back into our river systems? So this is something I'm becoming more and more angry about, more and more passionate about. And I'm really pleased that my guest today is going to tell us a little bit more about it. And, you know, from what I'm gleaning from this is that if you're fishing rivers, there's a pretty good chance you're going to be affected by these sorts of issues. So I hope this helps, and I hope that you'll get something from this, and you'll feel similar as we do about this right now. So I'm really, really pleased to be joined by Martin Smith. He is a keen fly angler based in Yorkshire. He cares deeply about trout and grayling and their environment. So he's like many of us, but he has also taken on his local water company after he discovered continual pollution from a nearby sewage treatment works. The really interesting thing is that he is an engineer who wrote operations and maintenance manuals for sewage treatment works for Thames Water. Carrying on from a recent podcast, the details he gives are shocking. And I like I said, I hope this inspires others to pick up gauntlets and let people know about what's going on out there. But Martin, it's great to have you. Thank you so much for coming along to the Fly Culture Podcast.
No, thank you. I'm very honoured. Hopefully I can help you gain some traction with this problem that we've got.
Well, having spoke to you, it was really interesting. You know, I know we touched base on Facebook when you'd seen the Fergal Sharkey podcast, and then we just spent probably an hour on Saturday where I was learning so much from you and from what's going on, and somebody who's seen things sort of from the inside as well. I think it's really important for people to know and understand what's happening, probably to their water course as well. But I wanted to start really, before we go down a negative path, to learn a little bit about you first of all and your fishing career. Whereabouts was it that you grew up?
I was born in a little village called Swanland in East Yorkshire. It was a village of about 250 families when I was a boy. Sir James Reckitt from Reckitt Benkeser now. He had a big mansion house or manor there some decades before I was born. But the village had no pub, you know, still got Quaker sort of values, etc. So just a quiet upbringing, really. It had a pond, but sadly there were no fish in it. Yeah. It must have been badly treated, but that will bring us on to another subject later.
Absolutely.
But, yeah, that's where I grew up.
Right. And when did fishing come into your life? Was it as a youngster?
Well, not until I was 11, actually. I mean, we'd all done a bit catching frogs and minnows out of this pond, etc. And on holiday, maybe catching crabs or things like that. Always had an interest in wildlife. But when I got to 11, I think my parents were wondering what the hell they're going to do with me. So they decided to get me a fishing rod and basket. And my father was working for what was Blackburn Aircraft then. They built the world-famous Buccaneer. And at the end of the runway was this huge lake system there. It's absolutely beautiful. It's since been taken over by Hull and District Angling Society, and they've turned it into carp ponds and various other things, making a great network there. But when we fished there, it was famous for bream and things like that. And that was a wonderful place to fish. We often used to fish overnight with a torch as long as the batteries would last. But yeah, it's a great place
Lovely.
To fish.
Lovely. And so that's where you sort of developed your love of fishing. Where was there a stage where, I guess the question must be, were there rivers or lakes with trout in, and where did fly fishing, or how did fly fishing come into your life?
I first came across it when again, I must have been about 12 or 13, and I fished a river with a bubble float and a worm. I think it was the Nid near Harrogate. We were on a campsite there, and they said, "Oh yeah, you can fish down the bottom." Much to this fly fisherman's chagrin, I hauled out quite a nice grayling, bonked it on the head, and took it home for my supper. The karma does get you back though. Climbing up the hill to get back there, I sat down and happened to sit on a wasp's nest. So I think the grayling got his own back. But I was fascinated to see this man throwing these loops. But that was just a point in time. And many, many years later, when oddly I was fishing the River Lee, which Fergal referred to, I must have been in my late 20s. I could always see how I was getting interested in the grayling fishing again and various other things, but I hadn't quite got round to it. And a friend of mine invited me to fish at Latimer near Rickmansworth. Yeah. And my first fish, which really he hooked me, I think, was a big brown male trout with a lovely cope on the lower jaw. So it was quite an incredible thing. And he took me there, and then at a later stage, he also took me to Roger Daltrey's place, which was quite interesting. That was quite fascinating. And then from there I sort of wanted to do it but didn't. And then a relative invited me to fish at Pickering Fishery Association, and I ended up joining them. And the rest is history, really. Just absolutely love it. Love it.
Yeah. So do you think that was the natural route at the time? And I've talked about it on previous podcasts as well, that you sort of, and I was one myself as well, that learnt on still waters and then moved to moving water afterwards.
Most definitely. Yeah. Well, in fact, there was another time where I saw fly fishing, which was rather odd. I was in Holland. I worked for Fokker Aircraft for 2.5 years. And a German chap was fly fishing for rudd, which was quite incredible. And then he fly fished for zander, and that was quite something. But and again, I didn't quite light my fire at that time, but I was still enjoying my course fishing. But there's something about the fly fishing, the fly tying. I could see it, like it, and want to get into it. But I didn't have any direct route at that time. You know, I'd be invited as a guest or something, but I didn't really quite know how to go about it. And that was it, really.
Yeah, I've never fished Lake Down. That's Roger Daltrey's place. If he's still, I think his son might run it now, mightn't he? I'm not 100% sure. A member of his family runs it, but I've never fished it. But I remember seeing the John Wilson programs there. I remember the advert he did for American Express years and years ago, where somebody was catching a fish in the background, and he said, "I better put the other one in." And I've used that as a fishing guide so many times you wouldn't believe. So that obviously at the time resonated with me. But that was, then they were the waters, weren't they? And everyone knew about the likes of Lake Down, Diva, and further up the line as well, some of those great fisheries. And then, like you say, I think probably the river for me was the Lee. I was a member of the same club as Fergal, and so I was fishing there. And that's where I really thought, this is what it's about for me. And that was it, really.
I think musicians seem to be drawn to it, don't they? The friend who invited me down there, he played in the Forest Philharmonic in St. Albans, and a very accomplished violinist. And of course, we saw Roger Daltrey there. And unbeknown to me, there was a long-haired guy with a shaggy jumper. It must have been one he'd borrowed off Roger, because he had one almost identical. And they were laying this concrete track down to his fishery. And it was only years later I was told it was Mick Hucknall.
Oh, wow.
So I think he'd been helping Mick to get out of the clutches of Sonny, and because he was good at that kind of thing. And the pair of them had been there. And then, of course, we heard Fergal the other day, which, if I might just, take the time, I have to say a huge thank you to you for sharing that podcast with me. It was fantastic to hear Fergal. My grandmother always said she used to have people that were welcome on her cloud and some that weren't. And I'm sure there was some she would rather throw a thunderbolt at. But Fergal would be welcome on my cloud anytime. And I thought he was such a gentleman in the way that he described the NGO's problems with funding. And whilst he wouldn't criticise them, he would understand it was difficult for them. And that was a key thing, I thought. But that was quite inspiring what Fergal said. So I hope I can add a little bit for you when we get to that.
Well, I definitely think you will with what you've got to say, and if it's even an eighth of the conversation that we had on Saturday, I think it will. And I think it's really important to, somebody like him was so lucky to have fighting that cause, and people listen to him as well. And like you say, everything was argued so eloquently that it was hard to argue against, and it was so well researched as well, and we were so lucky to have that. And it's inspired. I've always, as I've said on previous podcasts, sewage treatment works have been a bugbear of mine for a good 3 or 4 years now, and it's growing even more. And I've, like I said at the beginning, I've had enough now, and I want to try and do something about it. And that brings me on, I guess, to the main part of what we really want to talk about. And let's go into your timeline a little bit, because in the introduction, I said that you wrote the operations and maintenance manuals for Thames Water. How did that all start to come about? And did you find when you were in effect, I guess, the other side of the fence, when you decided, right, this is enough, I want to do something about it? So how did that process start, really?
Well, if I go back to my apprenticeship, I served with Hawker Siddeley at Brough in the first year, the general training year. And then I was such a bad lad, they sent me off to home on Spalding Moor, the flight test establishment. So it was make or break for me. But I absolutely adored it. I worked with such wonderful people there. And of course, you have to do things right. You can't sort of put an ejector seat in. You can't kind of put an engine in. These things have got to be very specific. And I know there are lots of people's jobs who are very specific, but the devil really is in the detail with the aircraft. And when you put 18 years of age and two pilots getting an aeroplane that you've just got ready for its first flight, it's quite a daunting responsibility. But you grow up a little bit. But I left there and moved to Marshall's at Cambridge and worked through various different types of aircraft there and learned a lot from those guys. And then by the time I was 21, I was on a contract in Frankfurt for Lufthansa. And I came back to England, married my dear wife of 41 years, and we settled down. I mean, it's hence when I got into the fishing at the League, because she was a Stevenage girl. But when I found it was too much like hard work trying to make money and afford a house in Stevenage, which is horrendously expensive for us starting out as kids. Now we'll be trying to find out. It's a terrible thing to get on the ladder. I got the chance to go and join technical publications at Hatfield. I'd been in flight test there on a 146, and I went into technical publications. And that would be the key to get to Thames Water. But within a few months, I've been headhunted and taken to Amsterdam. We all went out there as a family. But when we came back in 87, they wanted me to do some huge works. And I tried to work with another company, but it didn't pan out. So I had to set up my own company. Then there was the problems with Kuwait and the aircraft industry's all collapsing. Boeing didn't sell an aeroplane for 2 years after that toner cartridge bomber fiasco. All of the companies were going under. And sadly, I lost the company. But I managed to get set up again a couple of years later. And then we started to look at other things, did a bit of work writing for London Underground. And then the water companies, I thought, gosh, there must be something we can do there. And I contacted Thames Water. And they had this Framework 82 agreement to write all of the commissioning and operating and maintenance manuals for their plants. Commissioning being a very big thing for sewage, of course. And we wrote them for the smaller works. There were different phases of these frameworks. I was 82A, which was the small ones, but we were writing for places like Marlow. Now, you can imagine, if you had a sanitary towel float down the river at Marlow, you probably got 6 of the top barristers in the country, all as neighbours. Thames Water would be in a great deal of doo-doo themselves. So that was quite an interesting thing to see. And we had the opportunity to go and see the works, actually go and visit the works. But that was really sort of how it happened. sort of slid into it really. So I've gone from flight testing to all sorts of things, and then into writing manuals for a water company.
But what it does do is, as you rightly say, that the background that you come from is about safety and reliability. And that's where, I guess, since we've discovered all these wrongdoings, that you're figuring out what's going wrong and understanding where it is as well, isn't it? And do you think that's probably one of the reasons that you have been able to take these companies on a technical level as well?
Yeah, well, you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, one of my irritating traits is that I'm a problem solver, which is not good for a woman, my poor wife. If she has a problem, I should sit and listen, but I try and fix it. But she's forgiven me of these many sins because I've fixed a lot of things. But I'm that kind of animal. I just want to fix things. If it's broken, I'll not stop until I can fix it. I'm in my flight test background, I suppose. During some of my time, I was working for Monarch Airlines. You couldn't say at 12 o'clock at night, "Oh, well, we'll have to wait until the day shift come in." You just left to fix it. And one of my trips, we were in Greenland with a 146 on icing trials, and we had a fuel leak, and we had to fly the aircraft on 3 engines. So you just didn't, but you had to find a different way of stopping it, overcome the problem, or the oil seals would have gone with a impeller spinning and cranking up some of the pressure. But what we found, I think, was that looking at the sewage works themselves and having that background and not taking things on face value, we've got to look a little bit further than that. We used to have debates on whether a life vest should be by an aeration lane. Somebody said, "Well, of course you do. It's water." We said, "Yes, but aerated water is less dense than normal water, static water, for instance. With all this air blowing through it, you sink much faster. So a life jacket, would that be an encumbrance? Would it be more drag and even less buoyant water, i.e. certain death?" We'd have interesting debates like that. So we were always researching things. But when it came to the telemetry side of things, where the sewage works were starting to be updated for unattended operation. By that, I mean there's no operators on site in the little hut as there used to be. They're now, I think for Thames Water, most of those small provincial sites were run from High Wycombe. So the telemetry there would set off an alarm, and then the man with the van would arrive and would start to investigate and look at what to do. And it depends on, the commissioning, to come back to that. When they set up head detectors, they use a lot of ultrasonics to detect levels of water. They use lots of pressure sensors, particularly in inlet works, which we'll come to in a bit. If they're not set up correctly, then you can have a great deal of trouble. And in fact, at the local site at Thornton Dale, where we've got this fishing, the small works there has just had £2.4 million spent on it. I'd like to think largely because of the pressure we placed on them. And they had a commissioning engineer there for 6 months at least, and we still had problems with that works. So in 6 months, is it that the weather patterns haven't gone through all of the weather patterns yet? For 6 months, you've not had 4 seasons. Lord above, one season here can be 4 seasons all in itself at the moment with our balmy weather. But they had great difficulty doing that. So oftentimes we found that the commissioning setup and things like that, we couldn't take it on face value. And it's probably that tenacity, which annoys the hell out of some people. That tenacity is probably what's needed to be able to get the truth out of these people. And you don't have to be a sewage treatment expert to do that, by the way, which hopefully we can cover in a bit. People can still put pressure on them and get the information they need.
And for me, one of the important things to understand is that probably if you're fishing a river, there's a pretty good chance there's a sewage treatment works somewhere on that system. Would that be right in thinking that?
Oh yeah, at least one. Yeah. I mean, this is a small tributary. So if I just describe where Thornton Dale is, it's between Pickering and Scarborough. It's only a mile or two to the east of Pickering. There's a wonderful place called Dalby Forest, which used to be a grouse moor until just after the First World War. And either the shrewd owner decided they would plant timber ready for the next war, or it was for returning soldiers. But that in itself had its own natural stream in the valley. There's some wetlands in there which are triple SIs, part of it an SAC. But this small little stream wends its way between the trees, which is a wonderful thing because the trees tend to fix a river in place until you get one that falls in and it moves around and so on. But it's slower as opposed to erosion, where people have taken the trees out and anything happens, the erosion can be so rapid, it can be unbelievable. So that little sewage treatment works is on one of the purest waters that you could find. The water quality in it is absolutely sublime. But upstream of the village, there's a trout farm. I'll come to another problem of silt later on, but the trout farm's quite good because we could get inlet readings that are taken monthly by the Environment Agency. So if you've got a river and you want to know what's happening to it, you can use a Freedom of Information request with the EA, and they have to supply you with the random monthly readings of the inlet and the outlet from the trout works so that you can see what effect's happening within it. We didn't want to know what was happening within the trout works at that time. We were focused on the suspended solids coming down from the forestry when they were clear felling. But that was quite an interesting thing to do. But most of the small tributaries such as ours, if you put a sewage works next to it, you can have a phenomenal impact on there with just episodic pollution, because your 6-foot rod would span it in places and it might be 4 feet deep, or it could be 20 feet wide and just a few inches or something. Depends on the strata and what's happened to it locally at the time. And we're seeing that as we drive up to North Yorkshire, from East Yorkshire, it's a 50-mile trip for us to get there. We've seen other sewage works on drains and becks around the area, and all of that's going into the River Derwent. Now, I live near the River Humber, so if you imagine that catchment takes a Trent from Derbyshire, the Ouse and the Derwent, all those sorts of places, it's a seventh of Britain's water. And if you think of the population that's putting phosphates into there, you've got shampoos, body lotions, all the stuff that how many of you have had a bar of soap when you were a kid, wouldn't you? All of that stuff now, plus all the washing machines and the dishwashers and so on, it's quite horrendous when you think of what actually is being put in a river like the Humber, and it's still managing to get salmon coming up the river again. We even saw porpoise the other week. And it's just incredible that all of this stuff, the things like the pill, whatever, any of these medicines and things or hormonal treatments, all of that stuff goes into that sewage works. And unless one of the processes can capture that ends up in the river. And there is talk of the pill affecting sterility of fish and all sorts of things like that. So who knows? It's quite a horrendous thing, but most rivers have got them, yeah.
Yeah, and does that mean then that the water, the purification process isn't working correctly, so that stuff's the water's not being treated correctly, and it's getting in that state with those? Should those things not be extracted out of it, or what is the issue there?
I think the water companies are trying to play catch up, unfortunately. When they were privatised, as Fergal said 30 years ago, I think they got a bit of a rough deal, to be fair to them. I'll do a Fergal here. Let's walk a mile in the water company's shoes. There are two tales, really. I'll start with the one where what they've inherited. They've inherited a Victorian network, really. But they've got 20th, 21st century living. So if you think in the Victorian times, there wasn't the pill, there weren't the steroids, there weren't the drugs and things that we've got now. They probably just got penicillin or something a little while previously, So what goes into our drains now is very, very, very different to what it was 20, 30, 40 years ago, let alone 100 years ago when it was all designed.
Yeah. And I guess the issue as well is that you said it's Victorian. Population as well is a large part of that, I guess, as well, isn't it? That the growth in population since these sewage treatment works were put in place as well, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, fortunate for the sewage treatment works that most of us have all lost relatives in the 2 world wars, so Lord knows what the population would have been without that. But we wouldn't want a war to keep the population down to help the water companies, although I'm sure if they could save money, they might suggest it. That's my one flippant dig at them I will make. I think also that the investment that they've got to put in there, they could do anything with the sewage treatment works. They could double, treble, quadruple them if they got the funding. Now, let's take an easy route. Let's assume now that this need to have civil projects now. They could decide to double every single sewage treatment works in the country. But even though we may not pay for it in the water rates, if the government gave them grants or just one-off money for it, we'd end up paying for it as the taxpayer. So somewhere, any improvements to the works is going to be paid for by us. If I just bring another point in, when Labour wanted to be elected, they in the Tony Blair era, I was writing these commissioning manuals for Thames Water. And I had about 16 people working for me when I had a visit from Barbara Follett, the wife of Ken Follett, the author. And she was the prospective Labour candidate for Stevenage. I always thought it was rather odd that the wife of a multi-millionaire author would want to be a Labour MP, really. But what would she know about it? I don't know. Maybe she was brought up on a council estate like I was. But she came nonetheless with a PA who was more interested in pictures the boys had on the wall or things like that than she was in what we had to say. But with them was David Clark, the Shadow Secretary for Defence. And I explained to him I was not happy with their proposal to have a super tax on these utility companies. If you recall, Blair's promise was when we get in, we're going to tax these water companies. They've been gifted all of these assets and they've not really paid for it. It's a noble idea. However, it had a backlash that nobody expected. I'd said to David Clark, what do you think I'm going to do with these guys if you tax Thames Water like this? And he said, what do you mean? I tried to explain to him, these guys are going to be out of work. And he couldn't get it. He said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, Thames Water will have to pay their dividends in order to attract the investment that they need. They have to do it. There's no doubt about it. Because they have to invest. And they can't put the money up because Ofwat is fixing the prices and trying to keep them down, and the governments want to keep them down. So if you do it, they stop the investment, the works don't get updated. Let's say, for instance, we go down the route of the EU directives on water cleanliness, etc. They'll find that they're not meeting the directive aims. They'll get fined. And eventually, 2 or 3 years later, they'll come back to the marketplace. The valve manufacturers, the pump manufacturers, the pipe layers, all those people, all those companies have gone bust or have laid everybody off. They'll just wipe out a whole industry. And these 16 people here will not have manuals to write. There won't be any new work for them to do. And David Clark, to his credit, pulled up a chair and said, run that by me again, which I did. And he said, wow, the Shadow Cabinet haven't thought of it like that. I'll tell them when I get back. They got elected. Thames Water got fined. The work stopped. The men got fired. And the one man in the cabinet was not David Clark. Sadly, I wished he had been, because he got it. He got it straight away. So I'm like Fergal. I'm able to see the water companies don't always have it their own way, but then they tend to have to service the investors. And our pension funds are part of the investors. So we are part of the problem as well. So we want them to spend more money, but we don't want to pay for it. And we want our pensions to be profitable, so we don't want the water companies and the utility companies to suffer. There's an irony to it all, really.
Yeah, it is. Almost feels like catch-22, doesn't it? Because, like you say, the issue is they're beholden, the companies, to their shareholders, and they want to be able to pay the dividends so people continue to invest with them. But whilst they're continually polluting rivers, they will just continue to pay the fines instead of investing in the infrastructure. Until that changes, that's going to continue, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Today I've just done a bit of research, and I've looked, and in 2016, I think it was, Yorkshire Water were fined £600,000 for polluting a lake that had a spillage. This stuff's going to happen, we know that, but they took 5 days to get to answer one of the remote monitoring alarms that I talked about earlier. A whole set of pumps had failed. Something had gone out, an incomer or something must have failed. So the electricity was down or something like that, but all of the pumps failed, not one. And it took them 5 days to get there. And there were hundreds and hundreds of fish dead. Hundreds of fish would have been taken by birds or sunk to the bottom, etc. So they would never know the true scale of the damage, but they could almost walk across the water on the sewage. It was that bad. Now, they knew it was the network. They knew their pipes were bad. And that's easy to see, which brings us to this point I was going to say about all of the sites pouring into rivers. We talked about storm flows. It's easy to see when a pipe is ruptured that's carrying sewage, because you see the sewage. What is not easy to see is when it's a subtle thing that's nibbling away. And we've got a problem in that the sewage pipe in Thornton Dale is ancient and it's leaking. They may have hemp seals or something like that. Who knows? Again, this Victorian infrastructure. It could be that with the ground being softer, with the wetter weather we've got, that a heavier vehicle has gone over it. And they're not horses and carts, are they? Or light wagons from a Victorian area. They are heavy, heavy lorries. So if these things go over and they fracture an underground pipe and the water gets into it, you won't see the sewage. It inundates the inlet works. And by that, I mean it overwhelms the inlet works beyond its design flow. So they're designed to take so many litres per minute, be that hundreds, thousands, or whatever, depending on the size of the site and the population. Which oddly, yesterday I went there, there was a trickle coming out, must have been a flow about 5 inches wide, about 1 inch deep of clear water coming out the final effluent outfall. I ran to the storm to check it wasn't storming. It wasn't doing that. I went back an hour later and everyone must have been getting their tea ready or something because the water was gushing out of there. So it's the flow. But sadly, when that water overwhelms the inlet works, which is what I'm referring to, the flows, it has to protect the inlet works. It has to protect the main works. Otherwise, we would have terrible diseases. We'd be back to cholera and things like that, wouldn't we? So it's designed to weir normally from the concrete shapes they make to make these inlet chambers. There's a notch in the side or a weir in effect, and the water, when it gets that prescribed level, it weirs over there, which means any excessive water that the plant can't deal with goes out of there. Now, there are two ways that they can deal with that. One, it goes to the storm tanks, and in our small works there are 4, and they're like swimming pools. They're at ground level, the top of them. Or they can go into tanks which are above ground, like the old gas tanks that we've seen in cities. And they all can be seen from the air if you use Google Maps. And in fact, I used one and found that a sewage works at Pickering had got one tank with vegetation in it, the other one clean as a whistle, which comes to maintenance, which I'll talk about later. But in our system, when it gets into the first tank, it stays there and it settles out all of the waste. And then there's a second, a third, and a fourth tank. So when the water comes into the chamber that would go to the first tank, the blind tank, it then can't go in there, it's full. So it then goes to the second, then the third, then the fourth. And when all of them are full, it then weirs out to an outfall pipe about 2 feet in diameter, a short distance away, and that goes into the beck. And it goes into the beck just upstream of the final effluent outfall, which takes the treated water. Now, if the inlet works is being inundated with groundwater and then that's diverting and going into the storm tanks. Although that sewage is diluted, it is not treated. So there's a difference. So if you've got a bucket of treated water, a treated effluent, and you put that into the water, there should be no toxic shock to the wildlife. But if you've got a bucket of untreated effluent and you dilute it with 2 buckets of water or something, or a bucket of water, it's 1-to-1, I think is the ratio roughly. You put that into the beck, there's a toxic shock to the content of that stuff that's in there. And it will have a biological oxygen demand. It will, whatever comes down there, and you're talking of probably thousands of litres at some stages, that will have a biological oxygen demand, which will then take the oxygen out of the water. And that toxic shock could go through down a river, pushing things like grayling. They will flee from it because they've got a smaller liver by body weight, according to Richard Cove of the Grayling Society. They're the first to flee, really. And that's the problem, that you've got a sewage pipes. People see the sewage and they go, aha, the sewage. But people don't see the silent killer of these rivers, which is this episodic pollution caused by what we call false storming, that there isn't really a storm. And this brings me to one other point I would make to convince everybody we must do something about this. Yorkshire Water claimed that they had 9 sites that were in breach of consent. Now, they've got 635 sites and they run them all in more or less the same way. And I've said I'll come to maintenance in a bit, but they run them all in the same way. It's their way of going. It's their custom and practice. It's their processes. And they've all got this remote monitoring and telemetry. But there is a lie that most of these water companies perpetuate. They tell you, if you report it, that they are consented to put sewage through the storm outfall, which they are. What they don't tell you is that it's only when it's prolonged excessive rainfall and or melting snow. So if you've got a dry day or two, there should be nothing coming out of that sewage works. But on our little works at Thornton Dale, we found sewage coming out of it from September 2017, 24 hours, 7 days a week until May 2018. Now, call me old-fashioned if you like. The amount of sewage that came out of there in that few months, well, quite not a few months, 9 months, isn't it, or something like that, it was horrendous. So there's little wonder you can find bullhead, minnows, sticklebacks, there's spawning lamprey in there, the invertebrates are good, but the salmonids have gone. And the records show that 54 anglers out of 3 rivers locally, the match was won, the grayling match was won with 6 grayling out of this tiny little beck, and the bag weight was £6 4 ounces. Average weight was over £1 in this tiny beck. It was a phenomenal monster beck for salmonids, and now there are virtually none, which is shocking.
It's absolutely shocking, and this is going on everywhere, isn't it? And I know you quoted that 9 months, but it's probably been going on, the raw sewage a lot longer than that, I guess, hasn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, unless the sewage network decided to get inundated with the ingress of water the day we went there, it had been happening before. And the fact that there was the absence of fish before we even got there, there was something else. So that's the first thing, is the storm overflow, which people can monitor. So if you have a sewage works, find out where the inlet works is and find out where the storm flow is. If there isn't another pipe within the boundary or the equivalent boundary of the sewage works, if you can only find one outlet, it could be that they've merged the two together, which is even worse, because then you can't physically tell, is this sewage that's coming out of here or is it not? Pickering, an adjacent place, I'm at a club there, and they've had an ongoing fight for 14 years, and There's a sewage works, 2 trout farms and a cress farm up there, which I won't go into because there's politics involved and legalities, etc. But it's not good. But they've got a sewage pipe and I've seen it myself. I walked around the site once with the head of the sewage network from Yorkshire Water. Where it notches over, it goes into like a concrete flume. Now, it may or may not go into the tank, but Pickering's got a far bigger population than Thornton Dale, and it's got 2 small steel tanks sitting above ground, and one of them is full of, you can look on Google, you'd see it now, one of them's full of greenery, and it's got plants growing in it, so it certainly hasn't had sewage in there. And so they've got 1 tank, but what they do is they bypass it, and it goes into the final effluent chamber and mixes with the final effluent and goes out. And what they need is to be monitoring the outfall point, not somewhere else where the Yorkshire Water or any of the other water companies can decide to put their monitoring where they want to put it. And does pressure work? Well, I think it does, because we've now got a variation order been sent to us by the Environment Agency, and they are forcing Yorkshire Water to monitor the outfalls and the inlet works 24/7 and to keep the data. So they want to know the frequency and all of the things that are happening with it, what particles are coming out of it, etc. So that really will be the first step, I think, to start to put Yorkshire Water on notice that at that plant they are going to have to be accountable for what they're putting into that beck, because it's got to be measured and made available. So pressure does work. That's pressure we've put on the Environment Agency by reporting. Every time we go up and we see that coming out of there, we report it.
And how did you get that process going, Martin? How did you get them to turn up? How did you get them to listen to what you were saying? Was, like you say, you were continually reporting. Is there a point where they'll say, okay, we need to take this seriously? Because I guess this is happening throughout the country, so they'll address the loudest bit first. And, you know, as anglers, it's kind of what you're saying there is making me thinking we all need to be shouting really loudly so they're aware that this is happening everywhere. So they can't just make you quiet for a bit. They've got to make everyone quiet by investing in that infrastructure. How did that process start, and how long did it take? And you mentioned the word tenacious. What sort of levels of that were needed to make them listen?
One very simple thing people can do, if I read a number out from the back of our little pass book, it's only a small syndicate of a few people. We've got an EA pollution hotline on here, and I think most clubs are doing this, but it's 0800 807 060, or more likely 807 060. And if you ring that number, the people there will give you an incident number, which you can put as the subject in an email. So with smartphones now, the best way to do it is you take a photograph, which will timestamp it anyway. That's evidence then. You show it running, take the picture, or show what you found. If there's sanitary towels in the river or anything like that, all of that should be screened out anyway. Even if it's going out of the storm flow, it should be screened. You take the picture, call that number, they'll give you the incident number, and you can have an email ready before you call them. And you put the incident number in the subject line with all your details in there and press send. They'll give you an email address, ICS, whatever it is. If people need it, we can post it for them. And that information slowly builds. You start to get some traction. And if every time you go up to the river, or one of your members does, and they see something going, they just make the report. And the water company has to come out within an hour to deal with it, and the EA have to look into it. But the EA in our area, they tend to look to see if Yorkshire Water hold a hand up and say, oh yeah, we've poisoned the beck, which they never would. So we then have to argue with them. Look, it's no good Yorkshire Water telling us 2 days later that the water quality is fine. We all know the water quality is fine. It wasn't when the manhole cover blew up just by the bridge and put raw sewage neat straight into the beck. And plus it wasn't storming then. There wasn't rainfall swelling it or groundwater because the water level had receded. It was summer. It had actually just pushed the lid up, and it was again the commissioning. The sensors upstream and downstream of the screens that remove the rags hadn't worked. The rags had stayed, clogged it all up, the water backed up, and it blew the lid, and then just pure sewage went into the beck. Now, I don't know why they didn't get fined for that, but to me, that should be a career-making decision, that if someone hasn't got the thing commissioned properly, that screen just wasn't working properly. It didn't need to know whether it was winter, summer, rain or whatever. That wasn't a seasonal thing. That was just, was it clearing when it got clogged? And it wasn't. And it blew this manhole cover and put raw sewage straight in our little beck. And they came out 2 days later and said the water quality was fine. Well, yeah, the rest of it had gone downstream. Frustrating.
And did you lose fish as a result of that?
Well, there were no fish to lose, I'm afraid. They'd all gone. And that's the problem. If we'd had grayling there, they'd have been turning their toes up, or ventral fins or pectoral fins or whatever. They'd have been on their backs, but there weren't any.
Yeah. Wow, it's absolutely shocking, and this is happening everywhere. This is the thing out of all of this that I would love people to understand. This is probably happening on your river. We've got rain right now. The rivers are big, and water companies are allowed to discharge sewage into rivers, aren't they?
They are, but again, only the consent is the consent levels are irrelevant, really. Of sewage is sewage, but they can only put the raw sewage through the storm tanks into the beck for periods of extended heavy rainfall and/or melting snow. There's another issue that we've found that people need to keep an eye open for. So if you've got a drone, or a club member has got a drone, not an expensive one, just a little cheap kid's toy or something, if you could send that up and look down in the tanks, those tanks should be empty. But what we're finding is, and I'll come on this maintenance issue now, if they're not maintained properly, they fail to decant or be pumped back into the inlet works. So the storm tanks can't be emptied into the beck. It's only the overflow that goes into the beck. Well, only. It's the same noxious stuff. But the tanks that are holding, it's supposed to give your beck a breather. Shower of rain fills the tanks, doesn't go in the beck, great. Now we want it all to go back into the inlet works as the rainwater recedes. And if that doesn't happen, it means the next time it rains, it's rather like someone bringing you a half a pint of Guinness to put in your already full pint. It won't go in there. It's got to go somewhere else. And that's what's happening. They're losing this battery effect, this capacity, because the storm tanks often sit full through a maintenance program. So as soon as any rain happens, it discharges into the beck straight away. That is not consented. That's a breach of consent. And these false storming conditions that keep adding up and adding up and adding up. And they're putting solids into the beck. There'll be boron and all sorts of other stuff that comes from it that stays within the river.
And so what happens next for your little beck? You're on top of, in theory, on top of the water company, or they're aware that you're watching them very, very closely. What are you looking for next now? Is it signs of fish starting to come back? Is it, continually monitoring invertebrates, water levels, everything else? Is it just a big long-term project that you're trying to bring back to life?
Well, in theory, and we owe a great deal of thanks to Sean Leonard of the Wild Trout Trust and his team, and in particular Paul Gaskill, Dr. Gaskill. Paul and I had worked together on several projects when I was doing some work for the Pickering Fishery Association. We were restoring a fishery there. But Paul, very, very experienced. I'm sure most of your listeners and readers would know of Paul, and particularly of Sean Leonard and his team. And they did an advisory visit report, and they finger pointed to the episodic pollution as well, because they could see nothing wrong. The habitat was more or less there. But we've got lots of bank erosion typical agricultural area. The trees are missing on one side, willows encroach, create a low horizon. So if the beck's moved across 10 metres, the beck's the same width, it's taking 10 metres from the high bank the other side. We calculated it was something like 15,000 cubic metres of bank had been lost in about 30 odd years. So little wonder molten floods, is there? It all comes from somewhere. This is just one 1.2 kilometre stretch of beck, and there's how many that are going into the Derwent. But we found that with the Wild Trout Trust report, we could go to the EA, get a fisheries improvement grant, which the EA, we're forever grateful to them for this. It was a £4,500 grant. We bought post knockers, chestnut stakes, the faggots, do all the things the Wild Trout Trust would advise us to do. And as one of the Wild Trout Trust guys would say, we haven't lined the whole of the beck. We've done less than 1% of it, I'm sure. We found that we were slowly beginning to get closer to the fisheries department. And as we were talking to the fisheries department, then the conversations were about, well, why aren't the fish there? And then it was the pollution reports were going in, and it sort of gathered a bit of momentum from there. But I have to say, with my CV and my history with Thames Water, or doing work for them, we were able to see through some of the baloney that we were getting from Yorkshire Water. And one chap reckoned that the 4 storm tanks, by the time the water went out at the end, it was nearly drinkable. And I said, well, why spend 2.4 million? Why didn't you just dig 4 more holes? Which he threw his hands in the air and said, hey, got me, Yeah. But you get, there's a certain amount of bovine splattered that people will give you, to put it politely.
Yeah.
And you've just not got to take everything they say on face value. I mean, don't be blinded to what virtue there is. And by that, one Yorkshire Water manager from the network asset planning department, he came to see me, and I showed him a picture of a trout I'd caught just below the sewage works. And I was trying to show him that normally the water coming down and the sewage coming out doesn't seem to be the problem. I caught a trout there. And he gained my respect by saying, well, one trout doesn't show that we've fixed the problem, does it? And I thought that was very good of him. But sadly, he's left them now. And we've had a chain of 4 or 5 managers. So although Neville Muncaster, the director, he's moved now on to strategy, I think. He was the director of the network assets for the sewage works. He'd written me a letter and promised that they would try to look into this sewage pipe that needs relining. So they're CCTVing it, and they're going to reline it, we hope. That should fix that problem. But we think a secondary issue is that if there's any agricultural ditches down at the lower end near the Derwent, the fish recruitment isn't working because of that problem at the bottom, which is pulsing agricultural problems into it. And where the battery of fish that we used to have would be self-sustaining, they've all gone and fled, and nothing else wants to come back up. So the EA have promised us that when the COVID restrictions are over, they will look at the whole catchment down to the Derwent. But unbeknown to them, they don't know at the moment, but we're going to be taking on a lot more of the river lower down, so they're going to be hearing from us again.
Yeah, I bet they're looking forward to that too.
Yeah, but
yeah. So what is your plan with that? Are you going to just continue to try to improve habitat and most of all, obviously, water quality to encourage fish to come back and populate the river? Is that a like a 5-year plan? Is it a 2-year? Is it a 10-year? What sort of time frame do you think it takes for that to sort of happen again?
Well, this is where I envy bigger clubs, because bigger clubs can usually cope with life, what goes on, etc. We, as a small group of people, had 2 founding members who had seen a country file report about being in a river where there's sewage. I think there's a risk of hepatitis and all that kind of thing, which people have to be aware of. It'd be like Lyme's disease and Weil's disease. You don't plan on getting it, but you got to be aware and take precautions. Wash your hands and do all that kind of thing. And we found that when we've had a good team put together, and it's a small team, one person missing, and it makes a problem. With the COVID restrictions and clubs generally being advised not to do working parties, we found it hard this year. So my son's come and helped me, and we've probably put in, I don't know, 10 to 15 man days pulling balsam, spraying it, trying to get rid of sweet nightshade. I thought it was willow herb, but I've got the plant wrong. I just have to look it up. But there's another pernicious weed there as well. And besides that, the IDB have now lost the ability to come in and do some gentle work there. There were good IDB boys, by the way. If they took a bit of weed out and saw a lamprey, they'd get out and pick the lamprey up and put it in the beck. They were quite good guys. You never saw heaps of gravel with a bit of weed that they took out, and they didn't try to take it out when you got grayling frying and things like that. Well, not that we'd have any. But now the EA have taken it over again. There's absolutely no work being done on the river at all. It's all just been left down to a few guys. And I, for one, am travelling 50 miles each way to go and work up there. Yesterday I was back. I was there on Friday. There's only so much work that we can do. But patience is a virtue. We have got to wait now until the COVID thing's over, and then we can start the Facebook recruitment campaign, and we will fill up in no time at all. The members will come and join us because we only charge 60 quid a year. But it's on the premise that they know it's fishery restoration and the fishing is secondary. So we can restore this once fabulous fishery to its glory, but there's a hell of a lot of work to do. And it would be nice to share some of the duties in there so I can do more of the bashing of the water companies and the EA. We've just written to the MP in the area, but because I'm not a constituent, I've had to write to David Davis in Halton Price, and he no doubt will then pass on my complaints to Kevin Hollinrake up in that area. And prior to that, we've had Anne McIntosh involved. She was quite good, actually. Sadly, she got deselected in her area by her constituents, but she's now in the House of Lords, I believe, and she's quite good on the environmental side. So we can try and lobby those people, but we've got 1.2 million anglers. Sadly, the majority of them aren't involved, and we really do need as many of them as possible to make these complaints and to tackle this head on. To go out there and take the pictures and make the calls and send the emails and just be a bloody pain.
I think that's what we got to be, isn't it? And I know you've made that interesting point about writing to your MP, and I know that was something Fergal said as well. And subsequently, I got mails from people saying they'd written to their MP, having listened to it. Good. And, we've all got to, I think, if we care about our resource, we've got to do more, haven't we, like this, just to continually be in people's faces and let the public on a wider basis know about these things, because, and I know you and I talked about it on Saturday, that we get some headlines when stuff happens, and it's been wonderful, the stuff that's been in the press recently about the damage being done to rivers. But obviously, if you're not closely attached to them, those moments disappear for people who aren't entrenched in them. And I think we need to just continually keep pushing. And it was funny, I know everything, and just before we spoke, I tagged James Bevan in something, who's from the CEO of EA or chairman or whatever he is now, I can't quite remember, sorry, apologies. And when I first started doing it, Fergal said to me, he will quote, "Water is better than Victorian times." And lo and behold, his response to the Guardian article was that as well. So it didn't take long for that to come out. But I think we've just got to continually, as you say, be in their faces and let them know we're not going to stand for this any longer, haven't we?
We have. Sadly, I've had an interesting discussion with somebody today about the Angling Trust and Fish Legal. But I've got a couple of other bees in my bonnet. One, hopefully, if we have time, is the Angling Trust and Fish Legal, and the other one is about the trout farms and what they're doing and how easy it would be for Mr. Bevan and his cohort to resolve the issues. But I'll deal with the trout one first. It's just an example off the cuff. If people actually look for solutions as opposed to trying to come up with a clever reply that doesn't mean they have to do anything. Some of the things are so easy to do. I recruit scientists. That's my living now. Another long story, I won't go into that, but I recruit scientists. Some of them, we've placed policy advisors at DEFRA. don't blame me. I mean, they're probably doing what they're told. But I've never been ungentlemanly enough to call in a favour with these people. But I have asked one of them, how would you best make any changes to the policies within DEFRA? And she said, well, if you write a reasonable case in there, the policymakers are always looking at ways of improving things. So actually, you'd be cutting out the government and writing directly to the policymakers at DEFRA, because any of these things that could make a difference and make DEFRA look better, they actually want to look better. So the policymakers are trying to do things that are more popular for them. So that was one example. But from the trout farms, I gather they all tend to use something called Skerrit, I think it is. They make the pellets for them. And Skerrit's advertising, their claim is it's the most efficient meat producing farming in the world. So by that they mean for every ton of pellets, one gets 0.8 of a ton yield of fish to sell. Now, if you could imagine a graduate employed during the summer break from university, and the job would be to have a spreadsheet, all of the trout farms, and they can log all of the sales in tonnage, and they can log all the purchases of pellets, then they can see there's a correlation, and it should be approximately 80%. Or say it was 50%, 60%, but Skerrits have over-egged the pudding. What you could guess is there should be an amount of tonnage of waste produced by those fish. So 100 tons of pellets produces 80 tons of fish, and they produce how many tons of waste? I doubt whether it would be as clean as just, it's 20 tons or something like that, but there should be a way of them scientifically determining what waste to expect from a trout farm. So they can do that by the tonnage and the amount of pellets, and then expect what to get. Now, according to the EA, you can't dispose of any silt from a trout farm without a license. So if you were to put it on farmland, which would be most welcome, evidently, it's a good fertilizer, but not near a river. So you should know, A, where it's going, and B, where's the license. So how long would it take for them to see tonnage sold, tonnage of pellets, licenses for the stuff, and where's the silt? And if it isn't there, an officer needs to be dispatched to see what the hell happened to the silt, because usually it goes into the river. Yeah, that's an easy thing. Won't cost the EA any money whatsoever, and they could do that from the next break they've got, even Christmas they could do it. And it won't be any more work for the trout farmers. It should be an easy online thing to do. Now, that's one idea. The other idea is that if they've got these water companies now, and they've got these agreements where they varied these agreements, and they've got to produce this data, then the data should be equally collected and put, by a piece of software into something which then gives an alarm. How they can claim to have polluted 8 or 9 sites when we know every single one of them, due to poor maintenance, is polluting at some stage or other when it shouldn't. I just don't understand it. I don't know how they get away with it.
Yeah, it's staggering, isn't it? What do you think the EA's focus actually is right now?
I think there's a lot of flood alleviation work going on, and I have sympathy. We're talking about a hobby with a river.
Yes.
Some of your listeners will have been flooded, and my heart goes out to them. The River Board Authority caused a lot of these problems by cutting trees down, and then eventually deciding to put willows on one bank that they march across, push the river over, and all that shit goes down to everybody else. Look at the River Humber here now. I am sure that there is far more silt and banks of mud in the Humber than there ever were, and I'd love to do a Freedom of Information request to Trinity House to see what the sandbanks were before industrial farming took place, because that has a large part to play. But I don't know. I think they're supposed to be helping us with the fisheries. They're supposed to be helping us to cut pollution. They're supposed to be prosecuting the polluters. But I have heard that if the EA were to take you to court and it cost them £100,000 and they got their costs back, that the Treasury takes quite a high percentage of it. So in actual fact, the EA's budget would be transferring from them to the Treasury, even when they've had a successful prosecution.
Dear me.
So to do a Fergal, I can fully understand the predicament they're in, but this talking shop nonsense just doesn't work. And I agreed. I was nodding my head till it nearly fell off, as Fergal was saying, in 30 years, they've never been worse, and we haven't got anywhere. We have to do something different.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question? What do you think the EA's focus is on?
I think you're probably right. You having said that, I think the issue, again, coming back to that podcast, is leadership issues, and a clear focus on that. I think, as you rightly say, and down in the southwest, we had the big flooding 4, 5, 6 years ago, which, yes, is a big issue, as you rightly say, comparable to our little pastime. But I don't know is the answer. Aside from that, I honestly don't know. The poor guys who are out there in the field, they're trying to hold back the dam a lot of the time. And, I know the guy who looked after our river has retired, and there's one guy looking after a lot of rivers, plus out in the sea as well, in the estuary and everything else. So people are helping themselves to bass. They're doing whatever they can, or migratory fish as they come through, they're netting them. These sorts of things, they're just, it must be so incredibly difficult and frustrating. And I think it does need leadership, to be honest, and strong leadership.
Well, I could echo that. I know one of the fisheries officers very, very well in our area. He's worked with me on several things, and a more helpful man I couldn't wish to meet. He really has been fantastic. He put us onto the guy for all the materials that we needed, the chestnut stakes, etc., and the brash faggots that we were using. He put us onto how to make a lake an enclosed lake, because we had a brown trout fishery with stocked fish in it. At another club I was at, and we could only fish it 6 months of the year. And I said, well, how come you can go to Starcar at Leven and fish there all year round? And he said, well, it's an enclosed water. I said, well, there's water going in and water trickling out, just there is in this paper mill lake that I fish with, Pickering Club. And he said, well, you could get a grill put on it. And then he had 5 meetings with us about grills and things like that, what shape of bar to use. Wonderful man. And he came up to the fishery with us and saw the problems that we had. And he set up no end of meetings for us. So the fisheries officer, if you've got a good one, could be fantastic. But in contrast, there is a word of caution, because when I first made a complaint about one of the Pickering waters, I had a new pair of Orvis waders on. They're not cheap. And I was wading through this water, and the sanitary towel floated past me in something I won't even want to describe. And I made a complaint to the EA, and the chap said, well, I've seen that water. It looks fine to me. Who needs to bother with high-performance liquid chromatography or anything like that when you could just ask this guy to go and have a look at the water?
Extraordinary.
It was terrible. And another time he showed himself, which caused me to make a formal complaint about his behaviour. One of our members had taken 2 dead grayling into the local office, and he was ranting about having wasted 2 hours dealing with this when it had actually been electrofished in the morning. Didn't we know what was happening on our own waters? He just didn't care that someone had even bothered to go in there. So actually, he was against people turning up with dead fish. And his final sin was the EA electrofished this water to try and see what was in there, and there were no fish there the day before when the invertebrate sampling was done by a very, very professional guy. So no fish present at all. They electrofished it, and there were scores of stocked fish in there immediately downstream from the fish farm. So they believed someone had tipped him off. Now, it's not me exaggerating it, because the next time they did it, the EA brought electrofishers from outside of the area, and they didn't tell them where they were going until they were on the way. So they knew somebody had tipped them off. But this EA officer from the local office was standing over one of our guys monitoring it, and he said, look at that, there's plenty of fish in there. And this guy said, with some colourful language, can't you tell the difference between a stocked fish and a wild fish? These are all stockies. So it does depend very much on the local guy, but equally, I think sometimes you get a lot, you'll catch a lot more flies with a drop of honey than a gallon of gall. And I've never ever been rude or shouted at the EA guys. I've always tried to work with them. And sometimes they don't do what I want, but if you can win them round and you can get them on your side, it really makes a big difference. But screaming and shouting at them doesn't do any good, because those poor devils are doing what they're told to do most of the time.
That's a good tip. That's a really good tip. So let's summarize, Martin, if we can. We contact our MP.
Yep.
We report anything, and we continue to report it if we see pollution. Is there anything else that we should be doing?
Well, there's all the usual things that people are doing: invertebrate monitoring, etc. You can take water quality samples and so on and so forth. We've tried to learn as much as we can. Little incidental things make a huge difference. If you can make the argument that, as Richard Cove describes in the Grayling handbook or guide, there are 4 types of water. He talks about trout water, the higher gradient, then there's the grayling water, and then there's the bream water, and then there's so on and so forth. But he claimed that in the high gradient water, you don't get the grayling. In the next gradient water, you get grayling, but you get bullhead as well. The two are synonymous. And in our beck, we can prove that the bullhead are there in fantastic numbers. Every kick sample you do, you get a bullhead. It's unbelievable. And yet, there are no grayling. So that left us with the problem. And then there's the argument of the toxicity of water when they've got that toxic shock, and whether they're able to withstand it. But what could they do about it? You can try and make the fist of the argument. Do your homework, do your research, keep looking, trying to find out, is there water getting into the pipe, causing it to storm? Are there sewage leaks that you can find? Are the solids getting through? We found that looking at Google Map is a great thing, because we found that there's a third channel being dug from the sewage works, and there is no bund around it. So if a sewage works leaks, there's nothing to retain it, and it goes into this gravel trench or stone trench, and that's pointing towards the beck. So although there's no outfall per se, it's taking all of that spillage and putting it next to the beck. We'd have a hard job to catch it and prove it, because we'd have to be there. I think it's just generally being tenacious. Keep at them. Keep putting the reports in there. Don't give up, and keep every reply that you get, because when you write to the MP, mine's asked me to send them the details. I can't even send it to him. I've written a report. There's too many attachments. It won't go through his mailbox. So we've got to split them up and send them again. I said to him, are you sure? And he said, yeah, he wanted everything. But what the EA have done now is they've written us the letter, which is basically, we've done all we can. If you need any more doing, you have to escalate it. Well, Yorkshire Water are on notice now. They know that we're onto them. But one other thing that I would say that they need to watch out for, if you can see the septic tank, the storm tanks, we've heard on 2 occasions, this is at different sites, 2 sites locally to us, they get the septic tank waste tanker coming onto site and putting the septage into the storm tank. Now, if it rains, that stuff is super, super concentrated. It looks like crude oil, or whatever they'd put into ours looked like crude oil. I took a photo, it was black. Yorkshire Water will never admit to doing it. It could be a rogue person. Yet, the last place where I lived, we were quite remote. We had a septic tank, and the one before that was a small farmstead we had. That had a septic tank. But the tanker would have to come 6 or 7 times to empty it. And when they did it, they were back within 10 or 15 minutes. I said, well, how come you can't possibly have got to the Ferriby sewage works and decanted it and come back? He said, oh no, we go into the village and lift up a manhole cover and put it in there. But actually, ridiculous though that sounds, that's the correct way to do it. Because guess what? It goes through the inlet works and gets processed properly. Whereas if you put it in the storm tank, that's easy because they can belt it in there and not worry about overloading the flow through the works. So actually, the best thing of all is to get people with septic tankers to use a manhole cover somewhere upstream in the sewage network and to put it into there. But you imagine if that slug of that stuff, that could have been enough to drive the fish out. So maybe the storm tanks didn't do it. Maybe it was the septage, but we don't care. It's just something from that works is pushing those fish out. And you just got to keep at them until they've improved everything.
And the other thing I guess I'd add to that as well, and I see a bit of it, and I'm trying my best to retweet everything now as well on social media as well. So if you've taken photographs, put them out, let people know what's happening, and tag the Environment Agency, tag James Bevan, tag these people. And we need to, as the word Martin's used, tenacious, and we just need to be at them the whole time. And I think if we can keep doing this and people realise that we're not going to go away, perhaps we can get the momentum continuing from the great work that so many people I've been lucky now to speak to are doing. And if we can engage more of the fishing population to do this, that can only be good news. So, Martin, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me. It's been fantastic, illuminating, and really, really interesting. And I wish you all the best with your beck. I hope the trout come back. I hope the grayling come back. And I hope you get to enjoy fishing it sometime soon.
Well, thank you very much. And I hope it helps your listeners, and let's hope they can all, join the fight, really.
Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Everyone, this has been the Fly Culture podcast, and I hope this has been of interest to you. If you're as passionate about wild fish, streams that we fish, I hope this really has inspired you to pick up and help the fight as well. It's something that's not going to go away. It's something I don't think is going to improve anytime soon unless we can keep engaging as many people as we possibly can. Thank you again for listening. There's going to be plenty more podcasts very, very soon, but I hope you've enjoyed this one as much as me. Thanks very much indeed for listening.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter.